Community College. I'll be graduating in May, where soon after I hope to pursue a career in law enforcement, but I will also be returning for the Missouri Baptist program in the fall. One of the classes needed for this program is the sociology of racial and ethnic relations. We are in a class of about 20 students who have been working hard all semester preparing for this, and we are so excited you're here. This is considered our group project for the semester, so everything this panel discussion has been organized and prepared by the students. We've done our research, enlisted the panelists, wrote the questions that will be asked, absolutely everything, and we couldn't be more proud of the outcome. I'd like to start off with giving you some statistics over race and how it ties in with the criminal justice system. Did you know that the United States makes up 5% of the world's population, but holds 25% of the world's prisoners? Together, African Americans and Hispanics comprise 58% of all prisoners, even though they only make up approximately 1/4 of the U.S. population. This being said, 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend some time in prison during his lifetime, as opposed to 1 in 17 white men. It's because of these statistics, along with others, that we decided to have this as our topic of discussion today. With hopes of shedding light on some of the issues that flood our media and asking the tough questions that many may want to ask, but are too afraid of the answers they may get. The goal here is not to make our criminal justice system look bad, but help to expose some of the issues that are clearly affecting our society and what can be done to help alleviate said issues. This topic is something that is so important to me personally. I'll be honest, this time last year I was very closed-minded. It was hard for me to accept the fact that something I believe so passionately in could have all of the systematic issues that it so clearly does and affects the lives of so many people, mostly of color. We believe in the importance of educating yourselves on topics you may not be comfortable with and challenging yourself daily to help in any way you can. The panelists, in which we selected ourselves that you are about to hear from, are highly educated and should not be taken lightly. During the discussion, we encourage you to write down any questions you may have, and at the end you will be given the chance to ask the panelists yourself. Also, if anyone is using social media today, please use the hashtag LCCC Getting Real About Race so the students in our class can see your comments and reflections. With that being said, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Josh Renbarger teaches as an adjunct here on campus. He has formerly served as a domestic relations attorney in Missouri for 5 years and a clerk with the Madison County Prosecutor's Office in Indiana. Josh was chosen because of his wealth of knowledge about the history of the criminal justice system, and he has worked directly with issues related to the war on drugs. Specifically, he has a mastery of constitutional law, which applies to every topic we will be discussing today. We are so pleased he has agreed to join us. Please help me in welcoming Josh to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment, but I wanted to first talk a little bit about the format of the discussion today. The students have prepared questions for each of our panelists, and when those questions are asked, panelists will have 6 minutes to respond to the question that they're asked, after which we will open the floor to the other panelists for a 3-minute response to sort of discuss the question, discuss the topic together. And then finally, the panelist who was originally asked that question will have 1 minute to sort of sum up the conversation. With that being said, I'm going to introduce each of our speakers. First, we have Mario Love. Mario has a Bachelor's of Arts in Criminal Justice from the University of Missouri at St. Louis and an MA in International Relations from Webster. He has got a doctorate in progress in historical studies at SIU Carbondale and teaches courses here at Lewis & Clark in political science, international relations, and history. To his left is Dr. Larry Golden. Dr. Golden is an emeritus professor of political studies and legal studies at the University of Illinois Springfield. He has expertise in civil rights, civil liberties, and law and equality, and has spent his career integrating and fighting for social justice, and also working with where that fight intersects with educating on social justice. He has founded and is the director of the Illinois Innocence Project. Next we have Mr. Wesley Bell. Next we have Charles Palmer. Mr. Palmer was recently exonerated and released from prison just this past Thanksgiving, 2016, after spending 18 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. So he's bringing a unique perspective to this discussion today. We're all lucky to have him to offer his insight today. Next we have Wesley Bell, who's a professor of criminal justice at St. Louis Community College, also a Ferguson City Councilman, and formerly a private law practitioner. And finally, we have Detective Joe Splittorff, who has spent 10 years on the Alton Police Department. He's currently a detective with the Investigations Bureau, with a concentration on investigating crimes against children. He's also a member of the Major Case Squad and has investigated approximately 20 homicide cases on the Major Case Squad. So with that, thank you to the panelists for being here today. And I will start with a question for Mario Love. Mr. Love, the United States comprises approximately 6% of the world's population, but houses 25% of the world's prison population. Statistics show that 1 in 3 black people will be incarcerated during their lifetime, as opposed to just 1 in 17 white people. Since the 1970s, there's been an increase in female inmates, especially among women of color. Given these bleak statistics, can you comment on what historical factors have contributed to the disproportionate representation of minorities in prisons, both within the criminal justice system and within society at large? And as a follow-up, have any of these factors led to a larger culture of mass incarceration in the United States?
Can you hear me fine? Can you hear me now? Yes, indeed. Well, as a historian, I tend to try to look at things in the abstract, right? So if you assume that states are cultural, legal, and political animals, you recognize that they're organic, which means that they're always changing. There's a psychology that comes with that. So for the purposes of this particular presentation, the emphasis is trying to figure out how blackness has been criminalized throughout history. So if you look at, for the sake of argument, 1868, the 14th Amendment, which creates notions of citizenship for former slaves, there is the need to incorporate the principles of the 14th into state and local governments, which creates tons of subjectivity for those political entities to determine the nature of those rights. So you have to understand that in terms of the realities of blacks within state and local criminal justice systems, look at the Fugitive Slave Act, which again criminalized black bodies for attempting to escape from their masters. You correlate that with the peonage system in the 20th century, which also criminalized black bodies. So the suggestion is that indeed the issues of the criminalization of blacks in the 21st century has an overall historical abstract to which, if you go to Richard Nixon's 1970s tough on crime, the 1980s crack versus cocaine disparity, to which if you were in possession of powder cocaine, the ratio of incarceration, again, for those who were in possession of crack was 100 to 1. It's been reduced in 2010 through President Obama to 18 to 1, but the disparity is still very significant. So in as much as this is a legal question, there's also the questions how these things are perpetuated again. So you've got a federal standard, right, which essentially says that equal protection exists, but you've also got 50 different interpretations of what equal protection is. Then you've got 84,000 local communities, right, who subjectively determine the nature of equal protection. Within the sort of historical abstract that blackness itself, right, is different from whiteness. So law enforcement typically will focus on particular dynamics related to the abstract. So even if you focus on it as a legal question, the larger question you have to ask yourself is there a binary opposite when it comes to black and white? And the mechanism of enforcement by the state, you have to ask yourself why that exists.
So with regard to the state we're in with the disparity in the criminal justice system, you touched on sort of the institutional problems within law enforcement, within criminal justice. Are there larger societal constructs that contribute to this issue that are outside of criminal justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can look at just, as I said before, the state has to understand it's much more than a legal construct. It is a, every day there are millions of interactions that take place between citizens. As a consequence of that, there are millions of judgments that take place. So it creates a psychology to which the way that certain individuals are viewed reflects a particular sort of cultural construct that's been created for several centuries. So my suggestion is this, that inasmuch as legislation can create notions of liberation, right, it's much more difficult, right, to transfer the legal dynamics of it to individual lives. So the suggestion would be that law enforcement historically has been very subjective in terms of what crimes that they target. So for the sake of argument, you see, as I said before, these disparities between sentencing, tough on crime, what a criminal looks like, right? So typically, again, the discourse is quite different. So for the sake of argument, you can look at the realities concerning the crisis with heroin abuse today, right? Heroin abuse is not a new reality, but the way in which we look at it, right, we treat it more so now as an addiction versus a crime, right? But there's a cultural consequence to that, right? So for the sake of argument, many will criticize and simply say that when heroin addicts were Black and Latino, the sense of treating it as an addiction did not exist within the cultural dynamic. Whereas now, right, for the sake of argument, we don't treat it necessarily as a crime. The mechanism of criminal justice doesn't focus on it as a crime. Instead, individuals are treated as victims. So again, this is reflective of a larger historical dynamic to which Blackness itself has been treated historically somewhat different. And the fallout within the Black community is very significant. So if you get tough on crime in the 1970s, and it leads to mass incarceration of Black males, what happens to Black families? You have single-led households to which, for the sake of argument, 32% of women in prison are there for drug offenses, right? A lot of these women are women of color. Well, if the criminal justice system is targeting essentially urban communities, right, where you have sociological problems, quite naturally it has a negative impact on the Black family. So the suggestion would also be that you have addicts everywhere, right, suburban, urban, or rural. But if the mechanism of enforcement is very subjective in who they look for, obviously there's racial consequences to it.
Would anyone on the panel like to add or contribute anything? Or I certainly have questions for a few of you about this topic. So let me start with you, Mr. Bell. We just heard a lot about how there are institutional aspects of law enforcement that could be the issue that have led to the state we're in. There could also be kind of larger societal problems. As a city councilman, what do we do to address the current issues, or perhaps what issues do you see that are ripe for a change?
I think first we have to do an honest self-evaluation. Are we really serious about correcting the problem, or are we just going to continue with the band-aids that we have been doing in our society for generations? When you look at criminal justice reform, which we talk about, we hear about community policing, which I'm a big advocate for. However, you have to look at these problems comprehensively. When you look at the statistics, those who have education, people in this room, you are less likely to commit crimes. If you have a solid family situation at home, you are less likely to commit crimes. If you have gainful employment, all these things contribute to lowering the crime rate. However, they're not popular come election time. It's popular for politicians to stand up and say, we need to build more prisons and lock people up. that gets votes. But if you say, hey, we need to be smarter, we need to be more compassionate and try and enable and empower ex-offenders specifically, that doesn't garner you votes. And so that's why I appreciate opportunities like this to have these kind of conversations. Because when we look at Missouri, and Mario brought up a good point, when you look at Missouri specifically, African American males make up about 7 to 8% of the population, yet make up close to 48% of the inmate population. And I hope I said that right. They make up about 8% of the population in Missouri and about 48% of the inmate population. Now, some people will look at that and say, okay, well, there's a problem in the African American community. But when we look at the trends, which show if you come from a less affluent area, you're more likely to commit crimes. If you come from a more affluent area, you're less likely to commit crimes. I think we see that that goes beyond race. That's a societal, that's an American problem, and we have to start approaching it and looking at it as such.
Mr. Golden, you had a response as well?
I want to make a comment. Is this on? There we go. Okay. I want to make a comment at the conceptual level, because when I start talking in a couple of minutes, my comments are going to be much more grounded, so I'll feed off of Mario's. I think it's important to understand that, at least from my perspective, a criminal justice system is a reflection of the structure of power and the culture of any given society. Just think about that for a minute. Why do we have a criminal justice system? Well, it's to control crime. What is crime? Who defines crime? And so when we look at American society, we know that American society has been driven very heavily by money, by race, by gender, all of these different things. And so when we look at our criminal justice system, it's going to reflect that. It's going to protect the interests of those who, in fact, are the most powerful in this society, and it's going to be most damning or damaging to those who are on the outside, who are marginalized, who are viewed as the outsiders. And by the way, I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the fight within our society right now, because a certain segment of the white population is very fearful of what's going to be happening over the next few years when the majority of the population starts to turn to people of color. They're already fearful, and I think we saw some of this in our election, about the fact that within the last 30 years, women have risen to positions well beyond anybody could have expected. For example, the majority of law schools now, the majority population are women. You know, who would have thought that? Certainly 40 years ago, we wouldn't even thought that possible. Well, one of the ways to power, within our society is, in fact, through control of the law. So I think this is something that we have to be thinking about as we look at this problem. It's not that simple to really alter fundamentally the way in which our criminal justice system operates. But we can have an impact, as I'm going to suggest, when we get down to the working level of making some changes that can make some things better and avoid some of the most damaging repercussions of the system.
Thank you. And Mr. Love, 1 minute to kind of go on the conversation.
I think the gentleman makes an incredible point, right? So there's a philosophical term that's out there called the other. And what it essentially means is that those who are not part of the sort of main cultural matrix, right? A shared linguistic, shared historical, shared political universe, by default are sort of pushed to the margins. And the larger consequence of that, in terms of discussion that we're having, is that it makes them subject to extrajudicial actions on the part of the state. So, some would suggest if you go back to the 1920s, there was a bill proposed called the Dyer Bill, which was designed to stop the culture of lynching in the South, to which individuals who were protected under the 14th Amendment were still beholden to the state's interpretation of those amendments. So if an African-American male was accused of a heinous act in the state, they did not go through a court system. Instead, they were lynched. So blacks went to Congress requesting that a bill be passed to make this illegal. Well, the bill got filibustered and died. So as a consequence, a society to which individuals have been systematically put to the margins creates a larger sort of social psychosis to which when things happen to that particular group, there's a sort of shrugging of the shoulders, a sense that it's not a big deal. One can take, for the sake of argument, a few contemporary cases, right? The case of Philando Castile in Minnesota. You can look at Keith Lamont Scott in North Carolina, Walter Scott in South Carolina, Trayvon Martin in Florida, and over and over and over and over again, there is a sort of larger cultural construct to simply say that this is an isolated event. It's not part of a larger sort of social system, and we keep it pushing to the next thing happens. So my suggestion is simply this, that there has been a historical sort of time continuum to which blackness is sort of othered, right? And it is subject to, again, egregious and extrajudicial institutional actions on behalf of the state. So we see little consequence when we look at the ratios and incarceration between blacks and whites. We just simply blame individuals who are incarcerated and don't ask these larger questions. So it is what it is.
And I know we need to move on to the next question, but Mr. Palmer had something to add on this point as well.
I'm not much on statistics, but it's just like Mr. Golden was speaking. It's like the have and the have-nots. It's the powerful and those that are not so powerful. You know, I look at the system, it's just like, 10, 15 years, it's always about justice reform, but what's really changing? The changes are so minute. They will ease the pressure a little bit, but then it's another law that changed that put the pressure back on. The jails are making so much money off the incarcerations. The laws are really not going to be changed because they be talking about the overcrowding, but what they talk about, building more jails. There's plenty of laws on the book, there's bills waiting to be passed, guys can be released. But truthfully, I don't think it's going to happen. I spent 18 years waiting for certain laws to change, the easy pressure, but it's the people on the outside that's committed and dedicated to helping some of the guys on the inside. Because you have so many people that's maybe innocent. I don't know, everybody in jail says innocent, but I can't say that. But it's you all on the outside, it's people that's caring, that can help make a change. Because we on the inside, we're trying to make a change from the inside out, but it's got to be made from the outside in. So it's going to take everybody as a whole. We keep talking about those at the top, but hey, the little people can make a difference if they come together. I have seen it happen. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Go ahead. So our next question goes to Wesley Bell. Mr. Bell, in our criminal justice system, a very small percentage of cases actually go to trial. Most cases are resolved through plea agreements between prosecution and defendant, often offering shorter prison sentences in exchange for a sure conviction. In a system that already seems to disproportionately charge minorities, what safeguards do we have or should we have to ensure that innocent defendants are not advised to plead guilty to a lesser charge?
That's a really tough question. And so you kind of have to look at it. I have to address it from a micro level as well as a macro level. I started off at the Public Defender's Office for about 2 years, and I grew up here in Alton, and I kind of grew up in a dichotomy where I was fortunate to be in the gifted program, so I was the only African American kid in my class. Then I went home and my grandmother watched me, and I grew up in Alton Acres and Oakwood apartments where there weren't any whites. When I was a teenager, we moved to St. Louis County, in some apartment complex that was all black. So, I saw these different dichotomies, and it actually makes you appreciate diversity. But as a public defender, I came in with the act of knowing a lot of people who had either had run-ins with the law. So I came in as this gung-ho grew up growing up on LA law. I'm dating myself. Law and order. And so I wanted to try everything. So the public defender gives you an opportunity to learn the trade without having to worry about the business side of it, which I found out about as well. Now, as we were talking, as Charles and I were talking beforehand, I was fortunate. I worked in what was called the Special Public Defender's Office. So we did primarily conflict cases. So if two people were arrested, the public defender generally cannot represent both. It's a conflict. So we would come in and represent the other. So I didn't have the caseload that most public defenders had. And I'm going to guess the average public defender is probably averaging 100 cases on the low end, up to 200 and more. So mine was probably more in the 50 or 60 range, which is still a lot, but it's at least more manageable. And so from my experience was, hey, I want to try everything. So I want my clients to, let's take it to trial. Now what I learned is that that's not always in the best interest of your client. You know, if your client, and I use an extreme example, if your client is looking at 10 years and the prosecutor offers probation, you know, what am I to tell that client? You know, am I telling, you know, if I say, hey, he's saying I did not do it, and hey, let's go to trial. However, I want you to understand that if you lose, this is what can happen. And so transactionally, oftentimes these things kind of take place. So I'm not one to blame the public defender. To me, proverbially speaking, that's blaming the victim, because most public defender systems are underfunded, grossly underfunded. Now I work on the prosecutorial side, and we don't have those issues with funding. If we need it, we get it, because again, politicians love to say, hey, we need to lock people up. We love to say that. But when we talk about how can we help people transition from the community, which honestly goes more toward bringing your crime rates down than anything. I don't know if you're familiar with reentry programs, but those are the programs that help ex-offenders transition back into the community. And when you support those kind of programs, you see your crime rates go down, because, you know, when you get out, and our jails are not the best of rehabilitation. I think we all know that. When you get out and you don't have support, well, you can barely get a job, you can barely get housing. What are you going to do? You're going to go back to what you know, right? So if we give them that support, we decrease the likelihood of recidivism and reoffending. So from a micro level, that, you know, if someone's looking at several years in jail as opposed to probation, you know, they're in that situation where they have to make a decision that's best for them. Now, having said that, on a macro level, we have to look at it systemically. We have to look at our criminal justice system and from top down. What are our prosecutors, which are mostly elected positions? When you look at your county prosecutors, what's their agenda? Who are they answering to? If they're in a place where it's lock them up, well, guess what? They're going to fall in suit, because they want to get they want to keep their office. But if we're in a position where we're saying, hey, let's get serious, let's have these kind of conversations, well, we're more likely to have more fair outcomes. Because I'll say, my worldview is that if you harm people, if you threaten people, you should be accountable. But if you're doing things that just require treatment, then we need to look at those alternatives. So, you know, as far as safeguards, I think it's on us to be more educated. I think we have to be smarter about the things that we advocate for. So, for example, in Missouri, there was a time when offenders could get their associate's degree and work on their associate's degree. And that caused a lot of uproar. There were people saying, why are these people being locked up and then we're paying for their education? Well, if you're serious about bringing the crime rates down, why wouldn't you? And let me just use myself for an example. I do not want to be the victim of a crime. I think most of you would agree, right? You with me on that? I don't want to be the victim of a crime. And so if I know that a small investment decreases the likelihood of this person recommitting, not just, you know, even if we're looking at it from them, they'll be contribute to society, or if we want to look at it selfishly, as we are less likely to be victims, why wouldn't we support programs like that? So I think we have to be honest, and we have to go away from the talking points. We have to go away from the blurbs that sound good, because it's easy to say, why would we invest in someone who's who's robbed someone or committed a crime, as opposed to saying, how do we really keep ourselves safer and support our fellow citizens? And I think you get back to the same answer.
Before I open up the question to the floor, just a quick point of clarification. You said when you were with the Special Department of Public Defenders, 50 to 60 cases, but the average public defender was 100 to 200 cases. That's currently active at any given time, correct? That's not 100 to 200 in a year. That's right now on your caseload.
I'm not a public defender anymore.
Right.
I served my time. But I would probably say, particularly in Missouri, where I'm more familiar with, the average public defender probably has a caseload somewhere in the 150 range. Now, those are different levels, so some are closer to trial, some are further away. And you learn that if you follow the news, there's been a lot of debate about the public defenders pushing back, saying, look, we need more resources. And guess what? We got another $10 million cut from their budget last year alone.
Would anyone else on the panel like to discuss plea agreements, the pressure of plea agreements, the pressure of
Yeah,
plea
I want to say something about the safeguard they were speaking of. And it's just like, I think a lot of the safeguards, some need to be done about the hearsay, the eyewitness testimony, and you get an innocent individual in jail and the detective speaking to him, because I have seen it happen so many times. It's just like, okay, you know you haven't done anything. Maybe your first time in jail. Detective's talking to, we got a witness to place you there, or we got this that says your fingerprints on it, your DNA was on it, and I knew they do that because they told me that when they first got me. The first thing he said, man, it's blood on this shoe. I said, man, that's a lie from the pit of hell, because I knew it wasn't true. You know, but you get a guy that's scared, or a woman that's scared, and you know, you get to telling them this, the first thing they said is, we can give you 20 years. Okay, then they lock you up, then they hire you a public defender. He may come to you and say, man, look, they're trying to give you 20, take this 7 years. You know, hey, I haven't did anything, but I'd rather do 7 than 20. You know, you get a lot of guys copping out. And you know, in what ways? Talking about the overwhelming caseload of public defenders. Me and Wesley was just talking about this, because I have a thing with public defenders, because, you know, a lot of guys can't afford attorneys, they got public defenders. But maybe it is a caseload, but I don't justify it for them, because if you care, you know, if you're doing the job and you care and you're committed to your job, you would do it correctly. I mean, you know, I don't care how much of a caseload you got, but you got public defenders got maybe incarcerated in jail, county jail for 6 months. The day he go to trial, that may be the only time you see his public defender, or the day before he go to trial. They don't come see you. You can have somebody call, they still don't come see you. But then when they do come see you, man, look, say the attorney want to give you 15, I think I can get this down to 4. You'll take that and do 2. You know, I'm not, you know. So, I mean, like I said, it's not, you know, we can blame it on the caseload, you know, but if you have a career, you love the job you do, the life you have, you'll do your best at it. So, I make no excuses for the public defenders, the caseload in there. So.
I'd like to add something.
Is this on?
Okay. I think it's really easy to highlight a small percentage of situations where potentially someone who's innocent is, tricked or forced into, taking a smaller deal. I don't think there's any question that has happened, and it likely at some point in the future will happen again. However, I think it's important also to kind of raise awareness for the positive aspects of a plea bargain. First of all, you look at situations where various sentencing guidelines and things like that judges are bound to. If a case were to go to trial and someone were a first-time offender and they were convicted, they would be looking at a significant amount of prison time. That plea bargain oftentimes gives the prosecutor's office the ability to humanize the case to a certain extent, to be able to look at the individual that's being charged and see that potentially this is a one-time offense, that potentially this person is trying to get their act together, trying to go to school, various things like that. And so they're able to offer much softer sentences than than typically somebody would get if they were convicted in court. Additionally, I think something that's incredibly important, and I think there's a certain aspect of this to this entire discussion, is the cultural and the familial aspects of this. I know that I've been involved in serious felony cases, violent cases, where the offender was clearly guilty based on physical evidence, eyewitness evidence, various things, but yet family members were encouraging them to take these cases to trial, just based on mere suspicion of government in general, mere suspicion of the police. There's been cases, one in particular that I can think of, where I actually worked the case, and an individual ended up getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 more years in prison than he would have likely gotten had he been cooperative from the beginning and had there been some potential plea in place.
Yeah, I'll jump in. And that's why I always try to reiterate that, there's some complexities to it. I remember one of my first cases, I had a gentleman who was charged with robbing a convenience store, and they had a surveillance tape, and the assailant had on a mask. And I told my client, if that was not you, what I intend to argue to the jury is I'm going to stand you up. I'm going to tell them, look at the tape, look at this gentleman, and you'll see that this is not the same person. Look at his body, things of that nature. And I told him that if that was you, I'm not going to do that because it's probably not in your best interest. And he said, yeah, don't do that. So, but despite that, he had an offer of, I want to say, this has been years, I think it was somewhere around 5 years. And he decided to take it to trial, and it did not go well for him. And actually, I found out about this because his trial came after I left. He ended up getting, I think, about 15 years. And so, to the detective's point, I couldn't agree more that you cannot, in some ways, you can look at it systemically, and you absolutely have to, because, and I think Mario said it best, when we look at systemic racism and sexism and things in this country, these are things that we have to address. But when it comes down to your personal rights, these are one-on-one situations that you have to decide on what is best for you. And one thing a former client told me is that the worst time that you can do is the time that you could have been out. So, for example, you could have gotten 5, but you ended up getting 10. This is just what he told me. I've been fortunate not to have to experience this, but he said the worst time is after that 5 is over and you realize you could have been out. And so that plays into people's decisions. However, having said that, and I'll make this quick, systemically we have to look at the fact that we incarcerate more people in this country than any place in the world. One thing you have to look at is look around, look at the people you're around, or in this place, look at the other countries around you similar, and they're not incarcerating people at the rate we're doing, so we have to do some honest self-evaluation.
A couple of quick points. One is, one of the things that would be interesting is that if all of these people that Wes is interested in actually decided to go to trial, we can bring the system down. And frankly, I'm not so sure that shouldn't happen. 95% of all of our criminal cases end up not going to trial. And I will say that last year, the largest increase of any proportion within the innocence movement of people who were found innocent were people who had pled guilty. There are a lot of people in prison who plead guilty. And it goes all the way back. I'll just give you one anecdote, and then because I could go on with this. When we had the death penalty, one of the most common tactics of the prosecutors was to come in and say, we're going to give you the death penalty. However, if you plead it out, you won't be executed. One of the most immoral things that someone could think of, using that kind of tactic, but it was very common. And so I just think this is a much more complex kind of a story. And then to disagree with my close friend Charles here. There is a systemic built-in failure of public defenders, and it's not their fault in some cases. The caseload is well beyond the guidelines set down by even the American Bar Association for what would constitute a reasonable caseload. And I know that just saying it statistically doesn't satisfy Charles's concern, but the fact of the matter is, we know of instances, in fact, I think there's one up in Illinois near where we are, where one of our former students went into a public defender's job and is carrying 750 cases. You cannot visit everyone. You cannot talk to everyone. You just can't. It's impossible. And it's not good enough to say, well, if you care about the people and care about the job, you will do it. You cannot. It's because the system is structured that way, not because the individual is a bad individual. And so there's some serious systemic problems, not in all instances, but in many instances in the way we've organized our defense system in this country.
Very good.
Just to really quickly piggyback. Yeah, so it's important to understand that all of you are entitled to life and liberty, and it can't be seized without due process of law. My suggestion, just to piggyback on what Mr. Golden has said, is that inasmuch as you're constitutionally guaranteed due process, the reality is it's contradicted by this notion of equal protection but not equal process, right? Because the way in which it is structured, right, the state has a huge financial backing, whereas the public defender's office and your notions of liberty are determined upon your own individual economic circumstances. So your liberty is actually being seized extrajudiciously, primarily because you can't afford, right, to get an attorney. So again, you have equal access, but you don't have equal process, which means that there is a structural failure, right, at the core.
Thank you for that point. Our next question is for Mr. Charles Palmer. Mr. Palmer, during your trial, you maintained your innocence even with an alibi. Despite this, you were still found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. How did it feel to be an innocent man on trial in our criminal justice system? And while in prison, what did it feel like to try to clear your name for so many years?
First of all, let me say, you had to forgive me for being so negative, get down on the lawyers, but I mean, I just have no trust in the criminal justice system, you know. So, but how did it feel? I did trust the criminal justice system, you know, yeah, for about 20 minutes. But, I mean, you know, just like when I got charged with this case, you know, I said, man, you know, I told my family, I said, we don't spend no money on no attorney. I said, hey, they have nothing on me. I said, I will beat this with the public defender. And you know, it's just like, because all the evidence, all the witnesses, alibis, you know, it was all in my behalf. But, you know what I mean, the judge, I got so mad in court, the judge told me, if I didn't sit down, he's going to have me gagged and tied to the chair. And I was really upset because they wanted to give me the death penalty. They said I was facing death penalty. They offered me 20 years. I said, man, I'm not going to take a day, you know, but I had witnesses that my lawyers refused to call, you know, so argued with the judge. I had DNA evidence that they refused to test. They said the court would give us the money to do it, you know. They took a pair of shoes from me. An hour later, this detective come told me, oh, I see blood on those shoes. You killed this man. I said, man, you crazy. Like I said, that's a lot from the pit of hell. So they sent the shoes off to the lab just to give you a little history. Come back, nothing on the shoes. 2 months later, they did it all again, and they said they found blood on the shoes. And that's what convicted me. So my trust in the justice system is not there. Am I still a little angry with the justice system? Yes, I am. You know, I just like a guy, it was my cousin, that said I told him that I killed this man. You know, I said, am I bitter at him today? No. Was I? Yes. You know, but I have seen his mom and dad, or his mom act like she didn't see me. I had to speak to her first, but as my cousin, I told him, you know, the first thing that these people asked me was I bitter or angry? I said, no, I'm not bitter or angry at anyone, you know, because I blame, before I'm going a little bit off the question, but I over the years, I look at myself, you know, my lifestyle, a lot of people I was around, places I was at, and you know, so I have to take some of the blame for putting myself in that situation, you know, but should the justice system have worked for me? Yes, it should, you know, but it's still not over here, but it's people like Larry over the Innocence Project, people that believe in people that, you know, and they fought for me for a lot of years, but even today, it's still a struggle trying to adjust, you know. It's just like, I can go in some stores, you know, I'd be kind of fearful if the stores are too big, and Larry and me had told me this, that, man, you got to be careful where you're at. The police know where you are, they stop you. And a couple of days ago, police did stop me. No reason at all. He said, I didn't have my turn signal. I said, man, quit it. You know, so. And then they brought the dog, ran him around the car. Then he told me, he said, man, why would my dog smell drugs in your car? I said, man, don't start that. You know, scared to death. You know, they had me on the wall, patted me down. You know, but then the other officer sitting there with me, he talking to me because he knew I had just got out. And, you know, I said, man, I said, search the car. They just searched the front seat, you know, and the passenger side. They didn't go to the back of the car or anything and let me go. So, man, hey, it's good you out. And let me go. I'm like, wow. You know, so, I mean, it's just like, am I fearful some days? Yes, I am. To be around certain people? Yes. You know, but in trying to clear my name though for so many years, it said, what did it feel like? Well, you know, it felt like an uphill battle because you had to go through all the appeals, post-conviction, and you know, it's just like doors open, doors shut, you know. And I left Mount Sterling 2010, 2011, that's when the Innocence Project came on after that. But I went to Galesburg, and I just like, and the judge told me, he said, you got natural life, he'd die in prison, you know. But I said, man, you know, my thought was, it's not over till it's over. But when I got to Galesburg in 2009, you know, it seemed like I had exhausted all my remedies. I had filed every appeal, did everything I could. But you find great people in jail. And I found one man, he was 76 years old. And so when I got to Galesburg, I was a laundry porter. So we just sit at the table talking one day, and we just talked. He had asked me about my case. We did a little talking. He said, man, he said, let me file a DNA petition for you. I don't know nothing about DNA or how to argue. And you know, when people in jail tell you they want to do something for you, it's going to cost you something. You know, so I said, man, how much this going to cost? You know what the man told me? $5. He filed this DNA petition. 30 days later, the judge sent me a paper salad on a writ, papers going back to court. And that's when I won the petition. That's when the Innocence Project came on. And I'm trying to find Mr. Lee now. You know, I don't know if he's passed away or what, but it's because of that man, that motion he filed for me. It cost me $5. It's what got me started and why I'm here today. So it's just like, you can't find great people, you know, but I refused to give up, and what kept me going was hope. Because, I mean, what else did I have? If I refused to just bow down to the system, just be in jail, it's okay. This is my home from now on. If there was any way or any law could be changed, I was trying everything. You know, I wrote so many law firms, different groups, you know, and I just filed like incompetence with my attorneys. You know, everything I could. One thing, don't nothing be the failure but a try. That's what I always say. So, I mean, if I could write it up and put it in the mail, I send it. They can do it, tell me no. You know, you never know what's going to happen. You know, because I kept writing the Innocence Project. I wrote them. You know, they denied me the first time. They said they didn't have the money, so I wrote it again. Finally, somebody else came to me the next time. But you know, it's just like even out here today, it's just like even being out, being exonerated. I applied to different places for jobs, but even though I'm exonerated, if they check my record, it still comes up because they won't get off my record till they get a certificate of innocence, which is taking a while, but maybe in a couple more months. But it's just like there's always something, even though they say I didn't commit it, it's just like I'm still being held down because of some other law they got set in place where, you know, Chris Narcoot got a job. They said, we can't hire you as long as it's on your record. Why can't they take it off? I've been exonerated, but you know, it's still on the record, so hey, I'm still stuck, but I'm free, so I'm grateful. You know.
I know we're running a little bit behind on time, but
Yeah.
Mr. Goldman, and not at all related to your response, but Mr. Goldman, when we were in the green room, you were speaking briefly about how exonerees don't have some of the services and assistance that a recently released inmate would have. Didn't know if that would piggyback on this question just a little bit. If you could just briefly give your thoughts on that challenge.
Sure. First of all, let me just say I want to acknowledge two things. One is Jan and the students who pulled this together. The amount of work they've done is just fantastic. And thank you very much. The second thing is, if anybody wants to know why I'm sitting here, why I continue to do this work that I'm doing on a volunteer basis since I retired from full-time teaching in 2004, all you have to do is look to my left here. That's why I do this work. It's the greatest reward anybody could ever have, is helping someone like Charles to be able to try to pick up some pieces of their life after having spent it in prison for a crime they didn't commit. One of the things that I was talking about earlier was the fact that when the innocence movement started, it started essentially as a legal movement to get people out of prison who were innocent. That was the goal. And it was a bunch of lawyers and law firms and law students around the country. And the goal was very simple: bring cases to court and prove that people who were innocent, who were in prison, were innocent and could be released. What we've now realized with our success in the Illinois Innocence Project at the University of Illinois Springfield is a good example of that. We've now assisted in 10 exonerations. Charles was our 10th exoneree, and by the way, it's important for you to understand, Charles got out the day before Thanksgiving just a few months ago, and he's sitting here in front of this audience, you know, for the first time in front of a large group like this, and I can't be more proud of him in terms of what he's accomplished. But as Charles indicated, he too was struggling. And that's what we didn't understand at the time, that we were going to have to deal with at the level we are, which is namely, how do we help those people who would get out? You know, reentry has become a big issue in this country as a general policy matter. The governor of Illinois, despite all of his other warts, has set down a policy or a goal of cutting the prison population. I think it's something like 25% in 10 years. Well, okay, great, but where are these people going to go? What are they going to do? We face even a more unique problem, which is our people, when they get out, are actually innocent. They're not ex-convicts, as Charles was saying. He's really not an ex-offender. He's innocent. He never did that crime. And what he meant when he talked about certificate of innocence is that there's a legal vehicle that you have to go through that actually declares you innocent, not just the judge who lets him go. So there's been a lot of attention paid to things like education, to getting a job, to getting counseling, getting medical services. Hey, look, he was in for 18 years in prison. You don't get any of that stuff there. I mean, yeah, maybe, you know, if you're sick, you might see a doctor. You know, yeah. But I mean, you just don't get that kind of help. And just think of yourself going 18 years without any services that we take for, granted. And so one of the struggles we're having right now is, and we have 2 social work students from the University of Illinois Springfield who are working interning with us in our office, and they're trying to help put together a guide for us. But the one thing that's most important is to get down to the minute-by-minute challenge. And that is, when somebody walks out from behind those closed doors, what happens? They don't have any money. Unless they've got a support system, they don't have anywhere to go, literally. They don't have access at that moment to job services, to health services. I mean, what happens on a minute-by-minute basis, and and so when we talk about people going back into prison, who have come out, that's one of the things. The other challenge we face is that we never know when people are going to get out. It's not like they have a term and, okay, we know he's going to be out in 6 months, or the judge says, well, I'll let him out in 3 months. We can go into court tomorrow and the judge drops the charges and he's out. People have walked out of the courtroom. And I was telling a story earlier of a case we had where we got a call from the governor's office about 4 years ago, on a case that we were handling where there was a petition before the governor for a pardon or commutation sentence. We've been sitting. Friday morning, 8 o'clock, we get a call at the governor's office. Oh, hey, by the way, Peggy Joe's going to be released in 2 hours from Lincoln. Can someone be there to meet her? What? No planning had been done for that. We didn't expect this to happen. We had to be there. So this is the kind of problem that we're facing. It's a broader problem of the policies with regard to reentry, which right now is a horror show. We've got, I don't know if you know, and I didn't realize this until I heard the great, one of my heroes, Brian Stevenson, which I would encourage all of you to read his work, particularly his last work, Just Mercy. But Brian Stevenson, I was there talking, Brian Stevenson talked about there were 70 million ex-offenders walking the streets of this country right now. 70 million. Now, you just take that and think about what that means. And we've disenfranchised about 5.3 million, primarily African-American men who can't vote in various jurisdictions because of that. And then just think for a minute about the last election. 5.3 million people were disenfranchised. If a quarter of those folks actually had exercised their vote, think of what might happen. So we're facing a much bigger problem here that we're going to have to deal with. And we're starting to work on that, and I know a number of other people are, but it's going to be a huge, significant challenge for us.
Mr. Palmer, did you want to add any final remarks to some of the discussion?
No, I think I said that we got
Well, Dr. Golden, our next question is for you.
go for me. No.
So, Dr. Golden, and this may tread on some of the discussion you just had, so we'll kind of roll with it. Dr. Golden, is there anything that can happen in a national, state, or local policy level that can help assist organizations like yours to make it more difficult to wrongfully convict someone?
Okay, I'll try and make this quick because I know we're running behind in time. And I'm going to talk specifically about this question within the context of the innocence movement, which I just mentioned before. The innocence movement came about in the late 1980s, early 1990s as a result of advances in science, particularly around DNA evidence. DNA was the first scientifically based forensic test that could take specific pieces of evidence and link them to a specific individual, either to exclude or include. Okay? So it was the first time, there's been no other scientific-based forensic testing that can do that. Not fingerprints, which is what I grew up believing in. Not serology. None of these things could do this at the level that DNA testing could. And now, by the way, DNA testing has got to such a sophisticated level, we can take all kinds of things that we never thought would have been possible back then in the late 1980s and have them tested. So what happened was that a few lawyers began taking this, particularly Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, and they started working with people on death row all around the country. And within the space of a few years, they were able to take evidence, primarily in sexual assault cases, and demonstrate conclusively that almost 100 people who were sitting on death row in this country, and by the way, we're one of the few countries in the world, really the only advanced country in the world that still has a death penalty. It enjoys, as we saw in the last month or so in Arkansas, enjoys imposing it. But they were able to prove conclusively that those people were innocent. But they didn't stop there, and I know that you're probably wondering, why is he wandering off with it? It's because this is critical. The question then became, if we can take people like this and show that in fact they are innocent, the question is, how did they get proven guilty in the first place? What were the things that happened in trial that allowed so many people who were wrongfully convicted to get wrongfully convicted at the trial level? And there's a series now, we know, of factors that contribute to wrongful conviction. So I'm getting really right down to the micro level, very different from where Mario was a little earlier, and me. And very quickly, the most common factor in most wrongful convictions is eyewitness misidentification. And 75% of all of the exonerations in this country of people conclusively shown to be innocent, there's been at least one, and sometimes as many as 5 eyewitness misidentifications. 2, there's also been a history of false confessions. And since you're in Illinois, you should be very aware of the fact that Chicago has been labeled the false confession capital of the world, and has a long history of having police interrogations that have resulted in false confessions. And I wish I could go in and give you examples, but it's about 25%, 20-25%. 3, bad science. There's, the kinds of science that forensics has allowed within the courtroom is disgraceful. And it's disgraceful partly because a lot of it has been what we call junk science, but it's also disgraceful because of the rejection of science as the base for actually validating something that's brought before you. Tomorrow morning, for example, we're going into a courtroom in DuPage County, and it will be the first time in Illinois history that we will have shown that arson investigation was invalidated because it was not consistent with the science of arson that we now know. The case got overturned last week, and tomorrow morning is a bond hearing to determine what the state is going to do to fight it. But the case actually got ruled on last week. It's a good example of we now have a science which can invalidate what had in the past been just sort of general practices. 4, ineffective counsel. And that's a little bit different than what Charles is saying, but part of it is that a lot of lawyers cannot do a good job because of their conditions, but there are some lawyers who just can't do a good job because they're ineffective. And most of the cases that we have involve some kind of ineffective counsel. And 5th is the use of what we call incentivized informants or snitches. It's a very common practice, or has been, it's actually declining, for police to use people who are in jail and offer them a deal in just an announcement this week of a case where a guy had been paid thousands and thousands of dollars who was in prison to testify against people. So, all right, so now that we know those are the factors, that allows us to start working on them. And all I can tell you is that it's the base for reform. And we are, throughout the whole innocence movement, and starting here in Illinois, certainly, working on policies that would tighten up on each of these areas. There was an eyewitness identification bill passed by the Illinois State Legislature 2 years ago. We are presently working on an informant bill, Senate Bill 1830, if you want to just sort of keep track of that. It's in the Illinois State Legislature that will tighten up considerably on the use of incentivized informants before trial. We know that the practices that make for a good eyewitness identification process as compared to a poor one. Our first exoneree, for example, Keith Harris, who lives not far from here in Belleville, was put in a lineup 7 times. And on the 7th time, the victim said, "Oh, I recognize him. That's the guy." Okay? We just had another case 3 times put in the lineup. And what did they use? He was the only one. They used a mugshot. Right, we know that's a bad practice. And so if you know the causes, you can then begin to attack how do you deal with those. And we, at least in our project in Springfield, have three missions in the work we do: advocacy, education, and reform. So we're working on the reform part. There are things that can be done at the micro level. I agree, they don't deal with a systemic problem, but they do impact on some people's lives, and we're happy about doing that.
Mr. Valley, you wanted to respond, and then I'd also like to get to the detective. Go right ahead.
I'll say it quickly, and I think that's just kind of to reiterate his point, is that's why I push back on when we try to lay the blame at the public defender's office. We're letting ourselves off the hook. Everyone on this panel, everyone in this audience has some accountability. If becoming a priority, if funding projects like the Innocence Project becomes a priority, if making sure that our public defender's offices are fully funded becomes a priority, what will our criminal justice system look like at that point? But that's not where we are right now, and we have to start reevaluating our priorities, and that's why I think that's so important when you talk about criminal justice reform, is to look at where our money is going. That was quick, Jeff.
Great. Detective, and I've got the next question for you, but I wanted to hear from you on this question as well. We've heard about the statistics of how false eyewitness accounts are problematic, but obviously as a detective, you want good evidence, you want good eyewitness information. What are some of the challenges of dealing with eyewitnesses, and what, as a law enforcement officer, can you do to sort of weed out the bad IDs from the good ones?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that you have to do, and I think you have to be careful in any type of investigation not to look at one particular aspect. It would be very problematic to look at a single eyewitness identification and put blinders on and just to move in that direction. I like to think, I work with a lot of law enforcement officers from across the St. Louis region, and we, as a law enforcement community, have become more professional in the last 10 years or so, I believe, than any time in history. There's a lot of techniques and things that are used now that are much more scientific. A lot of the processes that we go through as far as analyzing digital records such as phone records, cell phone forensics, computer forensics, you mentioned DNA. There's a lot more of a scientific nature and process to investigations at this time in history that there wasn't always. We can look back a decade or two ago, and the majority of your cases were based on either eyewitness identification or circumstantial evidence. I can't necessarily say that I've had any cases out of the hundreds and hundreds that I've been a part of that we've got charged that were based solely on that circumstantial information. There's always a desire on the prosecution side to have that that piece of digital evidence, that physical evidence, and so I think that we're moving in the right direction in policing as far as the training goes, and educating our officers to go about things in a more systematic way.
Dr. Goldman, do you want to put a vote on your comments, or do you want to redirect for
No, I guess the only thing I would say is that our goal is, we talk about it often, as getting it right. In other words, we are actually partners with law enforcement. I know sometimes, even in the comments that I might have made a few minutes ago, it could be taken negative, like we're adversaries. In fact, quite the opposite. When you think about this world, what practice do we know of? Doctors, pilots, whatever, do we have that don't make mistakes? Okay. And police also they make mistakes, just like everybody else. And it's not always malice. We know there are examples of malice, just like there are examples of malice, again, in virtually every other profession. But our goal is getting it right. And I really appreciate the comments, because I think we're seeing in younger people, particularly in law enforcement, and even in prosecution, the desire to update and to develop better practices. I think ultimately I just have to fall back on where we started, which is conceptually. The bigger problem ultimately is we can have good people, but if they're working in a bad system, we can only go just so far. But going just so far might be important. It might prevent somebody like Charles from sitting here. As far as I'm concerned right now, although I would love to work on the macro level, when I see the opportunity, I do. My attention stays down here, trying to, let's work together to make this the best system we can. Not to satisfy us all, so we won't do anything to change it, but to help at least those few people we can within the system.
Our last question today is for Detective Splittorf. Detective, there's a perception that there's a division between law enforcement and minority communities that they sort of protect. What can police departments in these communities do to build common ground and to alleviate the sense that this division exists? And also, as a follow-up, what types of things can be done on an administrative level, as well as on an officer level, to build trust and cooperation between law enforcement and minority communities?
First of all, that's a loaded question. I think I could probably spend an hour on this one. I'm going to try and condense it just a little bit.
If you disagree with the premise, by all means, that's fair as well.
I think, first of all, I think we do have to admit, as Mr. Bell said, we have to be honest with each other and say that there is a division that exists. I think the unfortunate part is that division has been exacerbated, I think, in the last handful of years due to some irresponsible reporting in national media, due to the ability of someone on social media to instigate things that are possibly either half true or not true at all. So those issues do exist, and they are something that we do have to confront. I'm going to try and kind of break this up into pieces as you did. As we look at what police departments can do and what communities can do to alleviate these issues, the answer is a lot of things. I think there's generally a narrative that suggests that police policy and outreach programs are the sole way to solve this problem. And I think there's no question that there's a need for continual policy adjustments and to be mindful of that. And there's obviously a need for departments on an administrative level to reach out to their citizens, minority and non-minority alike. But I also think that it's important to address a responsibility within the minority community to also assist us in this venture. I think it's incredibly important that our minority communities become fully vested in taking their communities back. You know, when I was working out on the street, I would see on a daily basis the crime and the devastation that happens in minority communities, and you can find this in any city throughout the U.S. And at some point, we as police need your help. We need you all to take a vested interest in not allowing this any longer, and partnering with us. I think especially important is the need for a grassroots effort to break down this cultural norm, which is called the no snitching policy. There are so many heinous cases that go unsolved on a regular basis because it's not culturally appropriate for people in minority communities to cooperate with the police. And I think that's something that we have to address, because ultimately we can have the best of intentions to find justice for your families, to bring a case to a successful conclusion, but we have to partner with those communities. And as far as what individual officers can do to build that rapport, I think you have to kind of have your head on a swivel and pay attention for opportunities to where you can invest in people. I think it's very easy, especially in this profession, to be mechanical in your communication and to be constantly concerned about potential danger that you could confront. However, just something as simple as empathizing with a crime victim, spending a couple extra minutes speaking with them and empathizing with their situation, seeing opportunities to engage citizens in casual conversation when the situation presents itself, and ultimately, the bottom line is just doing your best to be fair and equitable in your enforcement activities. I think in addition to that, officers have to be mindful not to generalize people and not to become jaded, because let's face it, we see the worst in everyone on a regular basis, and it takes a concerted effort to put that in perspective and to realize that just because you see someone at their worst at a particular time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's their entire lifestyle. I think as far as how we can partner together, I touched on this a little bit, but the last several years, we have drew up a certain segment of the law enforcement community that's highly skilled, that's able to technologically solve many crimes that would have never been solved, even 10 years ago. But that still doesn't completely remove the need for community cooperation, for a human element ultimately, truthful eyewitness descriptions, identifications, even the smallest of tips about a particular crime are incredibly important, and sometimes the smallest thing snowballs into a very profitable thing. And I think as far as the challenges that exist, I touched on this already a little bit, but I think social media and our as a society, our need for immediate information has sometimes caused some issues, especially during questionable police-related incidents. There's a tendency to spread that rumor and that innuendo rather than to wait for the conclusion of an investigation. We've seen in Ferguson and in many other cases how that quick conclusion based on bad information can cause some serious damage to a community. And I think ultimately minority members, they must be unwilling to tolerate bad behavior within their community, and the flip side, law enforcement officers must also be unwilling to accept unprofessional, unethical, and criminal actions within their element, because as was stated earlier, we are all humans and we're all subject to making mistakes, and we need to hold each other accountable.
I want to say something. David just said, when he's speaking about taking back the communities, it's not, it's easy said, but it's not that simple. I mean, because it's just like, you got a lot of these different little gangs, and when different things happen, people won't say anything because you may get the guy that did the shooting or the stabbing, but he has so many friends and buddies, so people are really afraid. The pastor's son, I know him, he just got shot. I was telling Larry a couple weeks ago. The police are mad not because he won't say he did it, but I spoke to him, he won't say it because he's scared for his family. He won't tell his family that. Another little guy I was telling Larry about I'm talking to, because Uncle had me speak with him, he just got 12 stitches right here, got both his eyes black. And he had to fight with some other guys. So his uncle had me speak with him, and the young man listened, because the only thing he's talking about was retaliation. But I just been trying to talk to him, and he listen. I speak to a lot of the young kids around the neighborhoods I know, because if I can find someone that listen, if I can reach 2 or 3, that's better than me not trying at all. But when you talk about taking these communities back, it's the officers or whatever they're doing, they got to get down and dirty, because they got to get in there and get some trust within those neighborhoods. It's just not about picking up some guy, man, we just need a name. Guys just can't do that because it's a lot of repercussions behind that. It's a lot of fallout behind that. And just like, if you haven't been in the communities, if you haven't been down in there and know what's really going on, a lot of these people, even a lot of the neighbors, they're not going to say anything, because it's too much fallout from it. So, it's easy for us to say, man, we need to take the neighborhoods back. We need to take these communities back. But we out here in the communities right here, are you going to take them back? You just can't pick up somebody, catch a case, man, give us a name. Yeah, it's plenty of stupid, but a lot of times these guys just telling you something they think you want to hear, because they get deals off from behind it. So, you have to, I think you have to, a lot of times people say, you can't teach me anything if you haven't done anything, or if you haven't been there, you really can't tell me about it. Because it's just like I said, you got drug counselors that haven't even took a pill. So, how can you tell me some of the things I'm going to go through when I do this? You just have to, I'm no saint by a long shot. So, I done did a lot, a lot of stuff I won't talk about, but it's just like, I try to share some of my experiences, even the bad, with some of the young kids in these neighborhoods that's going through, because a lot of times I'm trying to tell them that a lot of these things that's going on within these organizations, these gangs, it's not for their benefit, no way, So, to reach them, you have to get in there with them, and you got to build some trust. So, that's all I can say. I can just drag this on. Go ahead. Go ahead.
We have time if you have time.
Absolutely. Abraham Lincoln once said that if you give me 4 hours to cut down a tree, I'm going to spend 3 hours sharpening my axe. And so it is important to have these conversations to try and to try and bring about that trust and confidence in our institutions, such as law enforcement and things of that nature. And, I come from a mixed bag. I have family members who've been in trouble. My father's a retired police officer. So I have that perspective where I've seen both sides of it. And I agree with the detective. And let me be clear. I've had a chance to, I think Dr. Thomas is here, and Chief Simmons and Alton. I love the work that they're doing with respect to community policing and things of that nature. But I think there's accountability to be had on all sides when we talk about it. I agree. And many, not just minority communities, I know that was the context of the question, but many poor communities you see a no snitching policy. And like I tell my students, that only benefits one group of people, right? criminals, right? It's the only people that benefit from that. But at the same time, there's a culture in many of our law enforcement departments of not telling on fellow officers, particularly when they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And so we need to change that culture comprehensively. And officers who are not doing their job need to go. And the officers, the overwhelming majority of the officers that are doing their job, they need to be supported. But that's why, as I mentioned before, I'm such a big advocate for community policing. And community policing is about helping, and I don't want to say restore trust, because when you talk about poor and minority communities, restoring trust implies that at one time there has been trust, and there's always been this tension with poor and minority communities in law enforcement. So we need to build trust, and that's one thing that community policing does. It gets officers out of their cars. It gets them to talking to people. And one thing that I say is that we got to start changing the way that we, as people in law enforcement, identify ourselves, particularly law enforcement officers. We're not warriors, we're guardians. It's not about how many people you arrest, it's about how many people, it should be about how many people you know in the community. Because that's how you start building that trust. And I think the detective kind of alluded to it, is that the more people, most people don't commit crimes around police officers, right? Is that safe to say? So, but people in the community, you tend to know who's doing what and who's not, who's doing what. And so if an officer has good relationships in that community, those people in the neighborhood, be it poor communities, African-American communities, they are much more willing to talk and share information when they trust you. And that builds trust on the other side as well. It's hard to hate people that you know, right? So when you get out there, when you talk to people, it generally is reciprocated. And that's why I think we have to look more so as a change of culture, and there's accountability to be shared on all sides.
Is that good? And would you like to briefly respond to
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mr. Bell said. I think there's a wide array of evidence to suggest that those relationships that we build as law enforcement officers are very beneficial long term. I know there's people that I've interacted with and met, several years ago that I could probably pick up the phone this afternoon and say, hey, listen, I need some information, and if they knew it, they would like to give it to me. And that's because of random interactions several years ago. So I agree with that. And to Charles's point, I think you're speaking about exactly what I'm suggesting, as far as when you're saying that you're speaking to young kids and trying to build that. The unfortunate part is there is such a pervasive distrust and lack of cooperation that it's going to take people such as yourself, people that do have that influence, to begin at those grassroots levels with young kids that are still forming their thinking and their thought process, to build that. I can show up with my gun and my badge and try and talk and try and reason, but at some point I don't have the same credibility as someone such as yourself, and so someone like you is definitely a part of the solution, I think.
I know there's a lot to say on the subject, and we're going to open the floor for some audience questions here in just a moment. There are microphones on either side of the audio link here. So if anybody does have any questions for the panel, we're going to make some time for that. Mr. Bell, I know that you have prior engagement, so if you need to sneak away, this is an opportune time. If you have time to stay and speak, no pressure from you, but that's available as well. Of course, if you need to head out of some point. But if anyone would like to set up any questions for the panel, please feel free. Introduce yourself and let us know what your question is.
My name is Patrick Mays. I'm an employee here at Lewis and Clark Community College. I come from Hunterstown, Mexico, for those who are familiar with all here. I had a problem with a lot of things that were said, and I don't say this to be confrontational. I don't say this to be combative. I say this to be real. Some things just need to be laid out on the table. Everything isn't so difficult. It's really not. And especially it's not difficult when we see it because we experience it. I may not have a PhD, but I can tell you what's going on because of my 35 years of living through this. My parents, my grandparents still have stories. So when you talk about this systemic sense of racism and oppression and things that the African American culture has been through, minorities, and then also low-income environments, that you have to be our friend. You have to listen to us. And I don't mean listen to us from a superiority type of position. See, one thing about slavery, one thing about Jim Crow, one thing about all of the race issues that we've had here in America that we have not paid attention to is that there were trauma on both sides. Not only the African Americans, but also the white citizens also. That was passed down from their parents to their children, and so on and so forth. And this is something that is truly being ignored, that there is a superiority complex that caused the problem where we are today, and then there's a superiority complex that is set in the solution. So when we come saying that these are the problems, there is a mistrust from white citizens that what we are saying is valid. And so I know that you're a part of the Constitution. I'll be real fast. But as far as the Constitution, there is a word that has never been, I haven't heard it, but it's posterity. It's in the preamble, but it's not in the Constitution. So therefore, the preamble sets up the Constitution. Now, posterity means for future generations. But if the posterity of the citizens of the United States is technically not covered by law, then there has been no law that has been broken. And that's where we need to start about the cause, because when we talk about this system, no offense, I'm saying this out of love. Let's not talk about it as if it's an object. It's not. It's people. It is people that is running that system. It is the people's practices that is running that system, and it is people's beliefs that are running that system. And because they are benefiting from that system, they either turn a blind eye or they perpetuate what is going on. So, coming from that type of environment, I have been blessed to work here now. I give back to my community, but I have to stand up and I have to say that you need to listen to us. And you need to start with the Constitution and the preamble and the posterity and how that isn't addressed moving forward.
I think those points are well taken. And that's sort of what Dr. Golden was talking about at the beginning of this discussion in his first remarks, and saying, when we look at law, when we look at the legal system, and I'm not capable of the word around, but don't look at it as a conflict. Look at it and realize there's some tension there. And who is writing the laws and who is, what's the purpose, what's the power structure. I don't know if you want to expound on that, Dr. Gould. And I appreciate your remarks. We really have to move on with questions. If you have a question for the panel, I'd love to hear it.
Well, my question would be is that, like I said, once again, this is a big issue. I'm a small peon person. All of you guys, you are the professionals. This is what you do. But I will say this, please listen to me, that when I say that, when you say about the intentions, we have to look at the intentions from the Constitution and the authors of the Constitution from the very beginning. And that's what we need to do. So please hear us, please hear me. There are individuals who have straddled the line, as yourself, Mr. Bill, who came from the community, does have the experience and does have enough education to be able to identify and to be an active participant instead of a recipient of solving this problem.
I just have one question. What role does the judiciary play in this process?
I think that
I need to warn you that I'm a retired judge before you answer. So, what role does the judiciary play?
I'm about to say. I actually served on the bench for a few years too, and I think that it kind of wraps into it wraps into the theme of what we've been talking about, is that systemically, when we look at our criminal justice system, and I do agree with the gentleman that the systems are made up of people. I think, we haven't had time to cover everything. And so that's why I think it's important that, and I don't know if this is where you're going, so I'm going to try to answer as best I can, but I think it is important to have more diversity, more access to the judiciary as well, because those are decisions that were made. I'll give you a perfect example. When the unrest in Ferguson occurred, I was a municipal court judge in one of the smaller cities. And it's one thing for people to protest, but then you also need people at the table who can actually implement some of these changes when fair. And so with respect to the judiciary, I think it's important that we recognize, one, you have to follow the law, as you know, as a judge, you have to follow the law, but there is discretion there. When someone comes before me, I can take in certain things into consideration with respect to what's a fair outcome. I have direction over how things operate in my courtroom. And I think that it's important to have diverse individuals in your bench, but also I know as judges we get training, implicit bias, understanding implicit bias and things of those nature. And I'll give you one quick anecdote. When I first came on the bench, I had a gentleman come to me full suit, and I was inclined to help him out because I was like, wow, he really put a lot of effort into that. What I wasn't paying attention to was the fact that the person who came to me disgruntled or not dressed as, and maybe not as clean as that. That person had child care issues. They had a job. They had to take the bus and they got there as quickly as they could. And I think that the theme that I'm alluding to is that need to be impartial, to understand that people come from different backgrounds, they have different circumstances, and should try and be as fair as possible. I don't know if that's where you were going with the question. I'm sorry.
That doesn't really answer the question. But you did hit on some points. My point is you cannot have a discussion about the criminal justice system without including all the players. And the judge is a very important player, because I've sat in courtrooms and seen judges basically control the direction that things were going. And so just as you have to have trained attorneys, trained police officers, and trained whatever else, you need to make sure that your judiciary is also held accountable. That was my point.
And I agree, and I'll just say quickly that if we have more time, I can sit here for 5 hours and we can talk about these things, because I agree with you.
Well, then let's have lunch and talk about it.
I'll leave him by.
I'll just make one or two very quick points, if it may please the court. I think Wes mentioned a key word in this whole thing, and that is discretion. Discretion plays a big role all the way up, and that's where we get into this idea of the system is made up of individuals as well as a system itself. And where judges have discretion, it's really critical that we recognize that and deal with that. I will say that the counter to that is, and we were talking about this in the green room, as they say, a few minutes ago. I've seen other cases where judges don't have discretion and wish they did, and they would have been able to do much better than follow the rules that the legislature and others impose upon them. So judges are not just autonomous figures. Just think about things like three strikes you're out, mandatory sentencing, and things like that. I mean, I've seen judges struggle with that. But ultimately, again, judges are part of a system. They don't define the law. The law, I mean, when you get right back to the laws are written in a certain way. If you want to write a law that says that, if you're found smoking a weed, you're going to get 5 years in prison, and that's the way the law is written. The judge doesn't have and the alternative was to impose the 5 years. And so they don't deal with the overall structure, but let's face it, the judiciary is a very critical part of this process, no question about it.
So very, very quickly. Yeah, so I would suggest, right, that you have, the principle of the law, the interpretation of the law, and you have to hold within that very, very thin membrane that liberty, right, in terms of individual protections, is balanced, and therein lies the conundrum, right? Because as suggested by Dr. Golden, you have human beings, right, who are basing principles of legal interpretation on their subjective experiences to the detriment of the individual liberties that come before a courtroom. So again, just to reiterate, you got 3 levels of interpretation. You got the federal interpretation of the Constitution, the state interpretation of the Constitution, and the local interpretation of the Constitution. And within, that matrix, you've got millions of individuals who are hoping that that interpretation maintains the core principles of individual liberties. And if that was the case, we would not be here today. So the hope is that the courts themselves, right, they're defined by notions of not just judicial independence, but judicial integrity. And the disconnect oftentimes leads to significant violations of not just liberty, but individual freedoms as well.
Okay. I'd like to, if we look at the program, pages 4 and 5, open it up. One of the things that stood out for me is I see Dr. Larry Golden's, I see that name doctor in front of that. On the other side of the page, I see Memorial Love, and I don't see doctor above your name. I don't see any advanced degrees mentioned by Mr. Bell, but he must have been if he's an attorney. I don't think that's a coincidence. The white male gets acknowledgement in the program. The Afro-Americans do not. And I have to note that the moderator, and I have not seen you not do this, the white male was addressed by his title, doctor, and the 2 Afro-Americans were not addressed by their title. I don't think that's a coincidence either. Now, I don't mean it was intentional. It probably was not. Usually it's not. But the impact is the same.
If I can address that really quickly. I asked everyone on the panel how they'd like to be addressed, and that was the reason for me addressing it.
Okay. So I'd like to ask the 2 white males, how do you address microaggressions? How do you personally address them when you see them? I've just done it. I'd like you to give examples of how you're doing that in your professional career to dismantle racism.
Were you speaking about the 2
Yes,
white males on the
yes,
panel?
on the panel, yes. You can join in if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to respond as a white male, I'm sorry. If you do, that's fine. I think we've got other things we've got to do. I mean, I understand the issue of microaggressions. The question you posed is very complex, believe it or not, in terms of how we were titled and everything today. In fact, I mentioned I would prefer not to notice Dr. Golden, but I'm not in control of that. But look, microaggressions is again, we've been talking today about all the way from systemic things down to individualized things. And microaggressions to me is a combination of our cultural, systemic situation we live in and then the way we act. I recognize I've dealt with this for years. I've taught about and been involved in issues of race and gender for years. I understand what the issues are. I also understand who I am, the privileges that I've been given as a white male in this society. I'm married to an Asian American and have 3 mixed race daughters, so I've experienced this throughout my life on multiple levels. But I think for our purposes right now, that's probably as far as I want to go in terms of addressing this, because it's too complex a question, but an important one.
I would just submit to you that I think that particular question is part of the problem. I think that just as there can be bias by myself as a law enforcement officer, there can also be bias coming the other direction. And I think at some point in society, we have to stop searching for a microaggression, so to speak, and be slightly more careful in understanding that we all are people, and things aren't necessarily as simple as a technical term out of a textbook.
Can I comment, please? Hello, my name is Jen Cline. My class is the one who put on, these are the people that put on this panel discussion today. They did every moment of planning and preparing for this panel discussion, including creating the program. And just to let you know, we had Mr. Love noted as Dr. Love in our presentation. We changed that today. We had him noted as Dr. Love in the program up until yesterday. Is that right, Kirsten, where we've corrected that? And so we did have Mr. Love listed as Dr. Love, and we went back and forth on titles on the program. We were concerned about calling Joe Slitorf detective versus Mr. So we went back and forth with all of these discussions on titles for the program. This is what we decided on, and it was out of respect for the doctorate degree, but we wanted to keep something, there's a base level there for sure. So that's my...
All but dissertation, so I don't like to claim titles I haven't earned, right? So preferably I prefer professor, without the title, because I don't have a doctorate. So, yeah, it's just only fair to the academic process, So we put, notwithstanding this.
And when I went to visit you yesterday, we discussed what to call you, professor versus doctorate versus. So these discussions have been had, and we talk about microaggressions in class, we talk about implicit bias, we talk about all of these topics, and these decisions were made intentionally.
I'd like to jump in too, Josh. I think one thing that I like to a theme that I like to go back on is we got to make sure that we're listening to one another. These kind of conversations can make us feel uncomfortable, or we can embrace them. Even though I think that in this situation, I know I'm going to call her Jen because that's how I know her. I know Jen very well, so I wouldn't think twice. I wouldn't think that for a second. However, we know that these issues do exist, and so instead of personalizing it, let's just look at it for the issue that exists, that we know exists in our country, these types of issues, and have the conversations. Because the only way we're going to move forward is if we are willing to embrace these tough conversations. So I don't take it in any kind of offense with this group. I appreciate your question, and I appreciate everyone in here for showing up and having these conversations, these discussions.
Hi, my comment is more for Mr. Palmer, and I just want to tell you something, Mr. Palmer. 13 years ago, and I might cry, I'm sorry, I met an exoneree from Missouri when I was the age of most of my students that are here, and I'm a criminal justice instructor, and 13 years ago, my perception and my bias about the criminal justice system and, innocent until proven guilty really changed for me, and I just want to tell you that I really hope that everyone that attended today heard your story and really, takes that back home and thinks about that. It's been in my mind since 2004 when I met the man that was convicted of killing his mother, and he actually was innocent, and he spent over 20 years in prison, in a Missouri prison. And I just want to thank you for sharing your story, because it really deeply impacted me. And I teach about the Innocence Project and wrongful convictions in my class, and some of my students were here attending today, and I told them how impactful it was for me. And so I just want you to know that we, as instructors and, educators and that kind of thing, we're trying to make this issue come to light, that we as criminal justice professionals have got to get together and be able to really look at what's really going on. And so I just wanted you to thank you, really, I did. So.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think today it is coming more to light, because I think a lot of in the last few years there's been a lot of exonerees, wrongful convictions overturned. So I think the courts are a lot of the prosecutors in the counties are more willing to, if there's evidence showing a person is, not guilty, if you can prove it, think they're going along. You still got a few rough prosecutors, but that get the good with the bad. So, thank you. I just want to thank you all for having me here. It's been great.
My name is Kevin Mogensen. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. I've learned a lot. I have just two quick questions. One is directly for Mr. Bell, the other is for the actual whole panel. To Mr. Bell, you said that the public defender entity could benefit from outside help. Like I would imagine financial and professional. With your experiences, would you feel it better to get those from actually like raising the taxes or like slashing other departments? And what I mean by that is like a faster response in actually helping the public defenders. And then to the whole panel, with all these issues that we face, are there any other countries with racial and ethnic diversity similar to the US, but with prison systems that operate different and actually don't face these kind of issues?
So I'll jump in first. I am going to head out. I coach a mock trial team in Ferguson Middle, and they have a trial tomorrow, so this is our last day of practice. I think it's more about priorities. I haven't looked at Illinois' budget in the last several years.
We don't have one.
Hey.
We don't.
Let's keep it clean. I have looked at Missouri's budget, and what it comes down to is the things that we value, we find the resources for. The community college, the higher ed in Missouri was cut by our governor, our new governor. If I'm not mistaken, about $80 million was cut, which about $20 million was the community colleges were hit. And so I would go back to our previous conversations is that if we're serious about, and I'm not talking about just jobs and job training, but also crime and healthcare. We're serious about that, but we're cutting the vehicle, the great equalizer that gets people there. I don't think that we're being serious about these discussions. So bringing that back to the public defender's office, when I look at it, and I'll go back to the gentleman who talked about our Constitution. Our Constitution was intentionally written vague because the founding fathers knew that if this document was to last, they couldn't be too specific because obviously they didn't know about the internet. They couldn't write laws about traffic violations. They didn't have that stuff. But there were a few things that they put in there that were mentioned specifically, and you have to attribute that they felt that they were that important. And one is the idea of people being treated fairly, having rights to trials, and certain specific rights. And so if we're serious about these rights, then we got to say, hey, this is going to be a priority. If we vote on those kind of issues, and our politicians know that, hey, this is something that might get me removed from office, guess what? That money's going to be found without a tax hike. But if we continue to wait and we continue to just let things go as they are, then we'll be right back in the same situation. So I don't think it requires a large increase in taxes or anything like that. I just think it means reordering our priorities. And with that, I appreciate Professor Cline, wherever you want to disappear.
Real quick, in terms of the second question, so you can try to divide it into two parts, if you will. So you can look at, the maturity of, criminal justice systems internationally, and look at some, very progressive system in Germany or Norway, and sort of abstract that and say that, look at it from an administrative position regardless of ethnicity. Then, in terms of the second part of your question, I would suggest that you always have to look at the relationship between minority ethnic groups and the majority population, right, in terms of how they're treated through systems of jurisprudence. So you would take this argument and ask yourself, historically how the Kurds are treated in Turkey as a consequence of being a minority. Historically, the Kurds or those of Armenian descent have suffered horrifically under Moses' jurisprudence. In as much as, let's say, arguing the Palestinians, right? In as much as they, in theory, have notions of independence from the Israeli state. The Palestinians are subject to larger systems of Israeli justice based upon this notion of majority-minority relations, which has a correlation with the Black experience here in the States, right? So I would say that there is a comparison that can be made internationally, right, between minority and majority groups to which those groups are othered. It doesn't mean that they don't have access to channels of justice, but it does mean that the way in which justice is distributed to those minority groups is very similar historically to the way African Americans or other minorities are treated here in the States. It doesn't deny, right, the need for the state to enforce the law, but it does mean that with selective and sort of prejudicial enforcement, particular communities are targeted and blamed as if their behavior itself is the issue versus the suggestion that violence happens everywhere. But it is the means of selective enforcement that tends to make it seem as if these are particular problems of communities of color.
Let me just make one quick comment. I'm still searching for the society that you suggested. The fact of the matter is that when we look at around the world, when we look even at human history, we don't see a lot of examples of societies that have been able to solve the problem of diversity. The second point, though, is that one of the characteristics of this society, which we're struggling with right now, and in particular over the last couple of months, is that we are probably the most diverse society on the face of the earth. That's why we were created in a lot of ways. I mean, it was and remains a place where people from all over the world, from all different cultures and backgrounds, races, have been able to come. That diversity is a blessing, but it's also a real challenge for a whole variety of reasons that we need a lot of time to discuss, but it is, I would say, one of the biggest challenges this country faces as we go forth in the future. But, you know, as I say, we're watching that literally almost like a slow motion film, you know, playing out right before our eyes right now. Are we going to be able to survive as we move forward as a diverse society where we embrace each other regardless of our differences on the surface? Or are we going to be a society that continues to struggle, to point fingers, to marginalize? It's in our history, by the way, I'm sorry you left, because our Constitution is not a good example of how to embrace diversity. And Wes should mention that too. When you look at the American Constitution, it was written for a particular group of people, and the terminology was specific. It left women out completely. You know, Africans were slaves, African Americans were slaves. This is not the best example to hold up as to how to build a diverse society.
One more question?
All right, mine's pretty straightforward, although I imagine you could go on about it for days. As a citizen of the U.S. who's not going into criminal law, I'm not going to be a lawyer, I'm going into psychology, what can I do, right? What are the straightforward paths to improving society in this relation, right? Like, how do we improve criminal justice for minorities if we aren't working in criminal justice?
I mean, there are a lot of ways you can do that. You know, we I think, have demonstrated with our work as an Innocence Project at the University of Illinois that we can embrace people from all kinds of backgrounds and disciplines because the work of the criminal justice system and the work of the political system require all kinds of backgrounds. Let me give you an example of two of the things I mentioned right off the bat that were critical factors in wrongful conviction. Eyewitness identification of false confessions. The research that has been done in that area is research coming out of psychology. There's a lot of things that impact. The work that's being done in forensic science is coming out of science, the hard sciences. People like Charles get out of prison, and every one of our exonerees suffers from a certain degree of PTSD. They need counseling, they need direction, they need help, they need guidance. So don't pigeonhole yourself and say, well, if I'm not a lawyer, I can't participate in some way in this. If I'm not, that I'm a scientist or I'm a business major and this is not relevant to me. No, this is a societal problem that comes from a whole variety of directions, and go hard at what you believe you should do with your life, but realize that you can make contributions. It's just a matter of finding that direction.
Good afternoon. So thank you for those of you who stayed. My name is Jen Cline, as I've said, and I am the Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Lewis and Clark Community College. And I'm going to keep this a little shorter than I was planning. All my students are coming up to the stage, and I want to start with this. The first week of class, I told them, we are going to be putting on a panel discussion, and I told them to think big. They formed committees, they identified leaders, they had subcommittees, they started developing a project. And I don't think I knew exactly what I meant when I said to think big. And this is what they thought, and this is incredible. Because of that, we have this panel of wonderful, incredible people. And I know I can speak for the students that are here when I say we appreciate your wisdom and your knowledge and working with us. The students here are going to be the next historians, the next police officers, the next detectives, the next attorneys, sociologists. I think we have a sociologist on stage, right? Are you still here? Okay. And I know they've learned so much from today, and they'll be taking some of the stories with them for the rest of their lives. I think that they have learned from each one of you something different, a little different part of the puzzle. And that's the spirit of a panel discussion, to put together different pieces of a puzzle. And that's also why you're all here. And this is all of us coming together, trying to understand something big and complex. Josh, thank you very much for moderating the panel. Are you up here still, Josh? So you played a really important role for us in helping us to understand the questions and what those questions and how they were going to be asked. So we have some note cards. There aren't many people left in the audience, but if anyone would like to give some comments to my students, I have some note cards. I'm sure they would appreciate those comments. And critiques, praises, anything that can help us next year when I start to develop this again. The first thing I think I have learned is that an hour and a half is not enough. So that's the first thing that I think the first piece of advice I will give to my students next year. Thank you again. Have a wonderful week. And don't forget to use our hashtag on social media. Thank you again to the panel. Truly. Thank you.